We are delighted to have you here tonight. As you know, throughout the year, we pair with several organizations, foundations, associations that do good work for Italy. Just to name a few, say Venice, Venetian Heritage, FAI, that is the Italian Monument Trust, the Bogliasco Foundation. And we do think that this is really part of our mission. We are not only here to tell you what we do or to talk about literature and the arts and cinema and music, even if that's what most of what we do, but we're also here to recognize the work of people and associations that throughout the decades, as it is the case of the organization we present tonight, have done fantastic job to support, help, preserve, restore the artistic patrimony of Italy. As you know, Italy remains, as of now, the country in the world with the highest number of UNESCO-recognized sites as the so-called patrimony of humanity. That includes from individual monuments to centers of cities to entire landscapes. The last one to be proclaimed was the vineyards of Monferrato and Langhe that produced the wonderful Barolo wine. And so it's still, and we are ahead of China of a couple of sites. I'm sorry, Jerry, but I do hope we'll remain the country with the highest. Jerry is a young Chinese man who works here at the Casa, but he's a big Italophile, so he's on our side. And the fact is that these monuments, this heritage, this fantastic cultural patrimony that we have does not stay on its feet just for the grace of God. It needs help, it needs support. These things deteriorate. These things deteriorate because of the normal course of nature, weather, and natural catastrophes, and also because of the work of men, including and especially wars. Without the support and the generosity of many organizations, such as the one we present tonight, that patrimony would be largely destroyed and no longer available for us to enjoy when we go to Italy. So that's why we do this. That's why we open our doors and present the work and the mission of organizations such as the World Monument Fund. I love the story, and I didn't know it before coming in contact with the organization, that begins in Italy, and I didn't know that. I knew that they did a lot of work in Italy because every now and then, when I go into a church or into a palace, I see a little plaque that says "Restored thanks to the World Monument Fund." But I did not know that the story began in Italy, and I don't want to take away the topic of the conversation from our speaker tonight, but I also love the story that the idea of creating this organization came from a soldier, from an officer, that after World War II returned to Italy and decided to do something to help preserve and restore the cultural and artistic patrimony of the country. We are delighted. How many of you have never been to Casa Italiana and are here for the first time? Very good, not many, but thank you for being here. Welcome, and I hope you'll join our mailing list. If you're Italophiles, if you love Italy, I'm sure we have something for all of you, from opera to the visual arts to literature. So it's a double welcome to the new ones, and a very warm welcome to everybody else. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker of tonight, who is the Executive Vice President of the World Monument Fund, Lisa Ackerman.
Thank you, Stefano. It really is a pleasure to be here. My boss, the president of World Monuments Fund, Bonnie Burnham, was meant to be here tonight, and I'm happy to be standing in here for her, but sad that she couldn't join us. She had a conflict arise that unfortunately couldn't be resolved. As Stefano said, our story begins in Italy, and I'm actually going to talk about things a little bit before World Monuments Fund began its life, but also to say that it's a great pleasure for me to be here because I too fell in love in Italy. I guess 30 years ago, I was a student and went to Florence on my junior year abroad, and in some measure never left Italy. Had the good fortune professionally to have a lot of reasons to go back over the years. So I am going to start the story actually in World War II. World Monuments Fund was founded by a man named Colonel James Gray, who was an engineer in the US Army, and he was stationed in Italy and North Africa, and then after World War II, was back in Italy as part of the US post-war reconstruction team. And so I wanted to put us in his mindset a bit. So this is a building known as the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini, and considered Alberti's first great commission, considered really the progenitor for Italian Renaissance ecclesiastical architecture. Rimini was actually bombed 3 times during World War II, and so about 80% of the buildings were destroyed during the war. So by the time Jim Gray was a retired US Army colonel living in the Veneto region, Italy was well launched on its post-war reconstruction efforts. And this building, which you'll see was heavily bombed, was rededicated in 1950, which was a Jubilee year. My former employer, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, actually gave the money to the Italian government to entirely reconstruct the church after the war. And I was very fortunate in 2000 to be part of the Jubilee Year celebration that was rededicating the church after 50 years. And so this is just to show that despite the heavy damage, the building was restored and continues to serve Rimini as the Cathedral of Rimini today. And what else was in Jim Gray's mind, perhaps? Really, the story of preservation as we understand it today in many ways begins in Italy. There were a lot of people in Italy and France and England after World War I and World War II thinking about preservation, but really the person who's the father of that effort is a man named Cesare Brandi. And he was the first director of the Istituto Centrale di Restauro in Rome, which is still today one of the major conservation centers, both for training, for research, and for actually doing work. And these are 2 of the books that he wrote that are really still considered the Bible of the preservation field in many ways. So that was the milieu in which Jim Gray found himself. In 1965, retired, not doing well in retirement, not a man who could sit still. And so he launched World Monuments Fund, then called the International Fund for Monuments, indeed was living in the Veneto. And the first project in which he got engaged was literally Italian friends of his said, "Come with us to Pisa." And what was the problem that they were trying to address, and why did they want this retired engineer to come? Well, obviously, the leaning was getting progressively worse, and there were great fears about what was happening to the tower. And there were a lot of theories. And one of the theories, and he was asked to evaluate it from an engineering standpoint, was could you freeze the ground, put pulleys and counterweights underground on the other side, and find ways not to straighten the tower, but to try and put the brakes on the acceleration of the leaning. In the end, they did not freeze the ground, but they did, in fact, insert a system of counterweights to try and assure that the tower would not lean any further. So that was his entry point. And then, less than a year after the organization was founded, in November 1966, tremendous floods hit Venice and Florence and really galvanized international efforts in both cities. But because Jim Gray was living so close to Venice, he really got part of the efforts to do things for Venice. And so this is one of the famous images of Piazza San Marco underwater. And what that led to was several things. One was the founding of a group of international committees that were put under the umbrella of UNESCO. International Fund for Monuments was one of them. Save Venice was actually WMF's Venice Committee that later spun off on its own. There was Venice in Peril, which was the British group. There was French, Danish, Swiss, quite a number of other groups, about 10 of them. Many of them still function in Venice today. And the result of that was Jim Gray, again, an engineer, a man who liked to solve problems, decided that it wasn't good enough to simply raise money and restore the buildings, but you really had to try and understand what some of the underlying problems were, because as he rightly understood, this flood was not going to be a one-time only event, and the city had to prepare. So one of the things that he did with UNESCO and with the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and others was help form something called the Misericordia Lab. And so they not only went about raising funds and restoring the damaged buildings, but they really wanted to try and understand technology. And so this image from the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista shows a group of scientists taking samples and understanding the building materials and how they reacted to being so saturated with water from the floods. And efforts and funds mobilized quickly. And as you can see here, these are two of the buildings within the San Giovanni Evangelista complex, the Oratorio della Croce on the left and the Sala Maggiore on the right. You'll see that the Oratorio was restored very quickly in 1978, and it was largely a paintings conservation program that these fantastic Venetian Renaissance paintings had been damaged, needed to be taken down, restored, and then reinstalled. And similarly, the Sala Maggiore is really a wonderful mix of paintings and marbles, all that were cleaned and restored and put back in service to the community. Interestingly, Jim Gray truly was somebody whose mind was always working, and long before we began to think about Jewish heritage and the experience of the ghetto, he astonishingly took on a project in the Jewish ghetto. And this is the Scuola Canton, which is one of the 3 synagogues that still exists in the Jewish ghetto today in Venice, one of the most heavily visited sites in Europe for Jewish heritage, and a thriving community today. So he took on a project that really was quite an outlier in its day. And interestingly, sometimes projects don't leave our lives. So Italy has been much a theme for World Monuments Fund, as has Venice. So we've had projects nearly every year from 1966 to now. And this is a picture from just a year ago in the Scuola Canton, because now the shelf life of some of those restorations of 30, 40, and 50 years ago are coming back, needing to be looked at again. So this is one of the conservators looking at some of the gilding issues in the wooden elements in the Scuola Canton. And I love these 2 buildings because I think they really show the breadth both of the architectural legacy of Venice and of the conservation efforts of all of the groups. So on the left is the so-called Vivaldi Church, the Church of the Pietà, and it was built, yes, as a church, but in many ways as a concert hall to showcase the music of Vivaldi. And World Monuments Fund, the Kress Foundation, UNESCO, and others literally restored every element of this building, right down to installing new lighting in the 1980s, so that this could really be a showpiece for Venetian architecture, painting, and the musical legacy of Renaissance Venice. And then on the right is San Pietro in Castello, which is actually very far out of the center of Venice on one of the outlying islands. And this was actually the original cathedral in Venice. And one of the earliest settlements in the lagoon was in this area called Castello. And San Pietro in Castello is not particularly a distinguished church, but that bell tower is one of the tallest in the city and one of the oldest. And one of the things that the floods did was undermine the stability of that building. And so the interventions were really very simple, and the interior is a very, very plain building, and little conservation was needed. But it's a nice way to demonstrate that World Monuments Fund and the other groups working in Venice, one of the benefits of collaborating with these international private committees was to assure that all the money didn't go to the most famous sites, but really looked at the full breadth of the needs of the community. And similarly, the collaborations have worked in many ways. So this is behind the altar of a church called San Giovanni in Bragora. And this is an altarpiece by an artist named Cima da Colignano. And Save Venice restored the entire exterior of this building. And World Monuments Fund restored only this painting. But it was a very, very interesting, complex conservation project, and really one where scientific methods were used for the first time in Venice by World Monuments Fund to really do extensive analysis on the paintings and the ability to clean it. And you'll see the test cleaning on the right and the full restoration on the left. So as the field has evolved, so has our organization and the approach to projects. And because we've worked in Venice for so long, you can actually look at our projects and in many ways chronicle the growth of the field. And the Cima da Colignano painting might be quite small, other buildings might be quite grand, and perhaps one of our most interesting projects was the monumental equestrian statue of Colleone, which is in a section of Venice called Piazza San Giovanni e Paolo, near the hospital. So while tourists might not always see this fantastic piece of equestrian work by Verrocchio, all Venetians know this sculpture because it sits right outside the main hospital for the community. And so this was a fantastic project because it actually was taken down during World War I and World War II to protect it, put back up, and essentially had never really been conserved. And there was beginning to be great corrosion and a lot of fears about would the horse collapse. And so a very interesting engineering activity took place where they decided it was too fragile to move it. They actually built a giant box around the sculpture, and all of the conservation happened on site, and with, sort of this gigantic box that stayed for about a decade. And then the picture on the left is from about a year and a half ago when I was there, and you can see how well the conservation effort has held up. And then we've really had the joy of looking at all aspects of Venetian life. So this is in Piazza San Marco, as if I were standing in front of the church facing the Museo Correr here in the main square. And one of the interesting things is we often don't think about the Napoleonic era in Venice and what that meant to the life of the Republic. And in the Museo Correr, on the upper floor, there's a suite of rooms that are devoted essentially to the history of that Napoleonic period, even called the Royal Palace, meaning Napoleon, not the King of Italy. And we were asked about a decade ago to help restore a suite of rooms that had been used as offices and storage, and were going to be opened up to the public, but wanted to be interpreted as this period of Risorgimento, so Napoleon and then the conquest of the forces against Napoleon. So this was quite an interesting project because these are little-known artists, not a period in Italian art that's especially celebrated. And the opportunity to be in Piazza San Marco, which is this glorious Renaissance square, and then deal with this sort of complicated 19th century history and bring these rooms back to public attention. And then I could talk for hours and hours about our projects in Venice, but I won't. But just to give a snapshot of the nearly 30 projects that we've completed since 1966, with many collaborators, both Italian and international, and really all manner of buildings from early Byzantine up to the 19th century. And our work has not been limited to conservation only. So in the late 1980s, there was very famously a Pink Floyd concert in Piazza San Marco, and the legacy of that was people realized from that concert, as wonderful experience as it was, the incredible effort it took to clean up after the concert, the security issues that came with it, and just that number of people in the square. And almost immediately after that, there was a proposal to have Expo 2000 in Venice. And the local community really railed against this. And World Monuments Fund, Save Venice, and many other groups came together to support the Italian communities to say no Expo. and also to demonstrate that the city simply could not take that level of traffic in and out of the small canals and, an otherwise medieval and Renaissance city. And in 2014, we announced the World Monuments Watch, and Venice came back into our lives, never having really left it. But we put Venice on the watch, not because we don't think people should arrive by boat in Venice. People have been arriving by boat in Venice for more than a millennium. But the scale of cruise tourism to Venice has changed dramatically over time. So whereas, say, 25 years ago, a few hundred boats came in, maybe carrying a few hundred people each, today, 1,500 cruise ships come into port, not annually, but from April 1st to October 1st. So it's a very concentrated period. And if that scale doesn't frighten you, you can take a look at this picture to show that when there are 3 or 4 of these cruise ships docked just off Piazza San Marco, what does that mean? Well, the local population in Venice is about 60,000 people. Each one of these boats carries sometimes as many as 7,000 or 8,000 people each. So there are times when 4 cruise ships come into Venice at once. And so you've got as many as 30,000 or 40,000 people getting off ships, all going to a relatively small number of places in the city, and essentially nearly equaling the local population. And I always say, cruise ships come in here to New York City and we don't even notice it because they just sort of get absorbed into the hubbub of Midtown Manhattan. But the impact on Venice is obviously tremendous. So I put a picture of the Grand Canal, a very early morning picture to get it with nobody there. And maybe we can't have that, and that's unrealistic to have such a serene image. But I think for any of us who have been in Venice when one of these cruise ships has docked, we realize that this isn't about being against tourism, but it is about thinking about how to manage that tourism better. And that was why we put Venice on the watch in 2014. So that battle rages on in Venice. We'll see there's now new elections, new mayors, new head of the Port Authority, and we'll see where that all goes. So I actually wanted to leave Italy for a moment because one of the things Italy has is tremendous expertise in conservation. And if you go around the world, you will often find Italian conservators have been extremely helpful in protecting monuments throughout the world. So Jim Gray, never a man who knew the word no, apparently, just as he was dealing with all the issues in Venice, in 1967, he launched his first big project outside of Venice, which was in Lalibela, Ethiopia. And Ethiopia had briefly been an Italian colony, so there was great Italian affinity for Ethiopia. Lalibela is a great 13th, 14th century Christian pilgrimage site, still a main Christian site in Ethiopia today, the seat of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And this is this phenomenal landscape and what it looked like in the 1970s when World Monuments Fund was working there on a conservation project. And what is Lalibela? Well, it's a series of 11 churches carved into live rock, so not quarried stone, but actually just carved directly into the escarpment. And these are fully formed buildings that function as churches. And the Italians that Jim Gray organized basically initiated a conservation program to document the problems because there was water infiltration and other issues that seemed to be causing erosion. These churches are so important that when the first World Heritage List was put out, the churches of Lalibela were on it. And World Monuments Fund worked there until the country was politically unstable in the mid-1970s, and the Italian team disbanded. And here's an image from the 1970s of the Italian and Ethiopian conservation team working on one of the churches. And we actually went back to Lalibela a few years ago, once again with a team of Italian engineers who spent several years analyzing fissures that had opened up in the rock that were causing water infiltration damage. And we're now just launching a project this very week to conserve this church that this nun is standing in, with, once again, an Italian Ethiopian and American joint team. So I wanted to leave Italy a little bit just to say that the Italian expertise is so important to the cultural heritage world. And it's not just in Italy, but that ability to export expertise and share it with people around the world. So coming back to Italy, the World Monuments Watch was launched in 1996 as a way for World Monuments Fund to understand better the challenges in the field and to really cast a wider net. And since 1996, about 700 sites have been on the watch. It's a list of endangered sites that is announced every 2 years. We'll announce the 2016 watch in October, so it's coming up. And Italy has figured prominently in that list as well. So in 1996, on that very first list, there was Pompeii, Nero's Golden Palace in Rome, and the Temple of Hercules and the Temple of Portunus in Rome, which I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. I'm going to say that Pompeii was a very interesting project because it was on in 1996, yes, for conservation issues, but really for tourism management issues. And so a lot of the work was not analyzing conditions, but trying to understand how people visited the site. And a bit like Venice, during high season, about 2 million tourists a year visit Pompeii. And again, it's a very, very concentrated period. So you could go from October to April and see nobody, and then you could go June, July, and August and be there with as many as 30 or 40,000 people a day. So the impact on the streets of Pompeii, and then there's sites like Herculaneum right nearby and Castelmaria di Stabia right nearby in Oplantis, which were also affected by the eruption in 79 AD. But which are very little visited. So part of our work when we were working on this project was to try and demonstrate that you could have a broader tourism experience and convince people that on days when Pompeii was very, very crowded, you could go and have a comparable experience at these other sites. So we dealt a lot with tourism management issues. And so, one of the things that we did was draw up a lot of images like this showing the urban area and also demonstrating to the local authorities that one of the issues was at any given time, only about a third of the site in that era was open to the public. So you were putting tremendous pressure, once again, on a very small number of places within the site. And so the hope was to try and develop itineraries that would spread tourists out through a greater part of the site. And then through the watch, we also learned about other places. So this is Civita di Bagnoregio, which is one of the hill towns about halfway between Florence and Rome. Pitigliano is another one that's quite famous. And these are such evocative places and important for tourists, but also for the people who live there and what was happening to them. Well, in Pitigliano, one of the reasons it was on the watch was Pitigliano is this wonderful medieval hill town, but underneath it is an Etruscan city, and underneath that are a series of caves that connect all throughout the city. And one of the things that had been discovered and why it was on the watch was that the University of Florence had done mapping of the city to demonstrate that there were places where buildings were essentially sitting on top of voids, not connected to anything. And this is a seismic area. And so there was also the fear that with certain kinds of earthquakes, the city would really be reduced to rubble. And they couldn't do the kind of engineering pinning that you see in places because of these voids underneath the buildings. It was like Swiss cheese. So the opportunities to figure out through technology how, in essence, to pin the buildings into place. And Civita di Bagnoregio is an even more interesting place than Pitigliano in many ways because it shows even more the connection between the Etruscan cities and the countryside and the medieval city that sits on top of the hill. And so we worked with a number of colleagues in Italy, and really the most important thing we did after this was on the watch was to bring together a group of scientists who were working all over Italy on these very projects, but had never been together with each other. So we were able to convene a group of about 50 people who spent a week together, and then we published a report of all of their findings. And it was this great way to connect people who you'd think would have known each other, but it really took the World Monuments Watch as a kind of catalyst to bring everybody together. So the Watch, for many of us on the staff, is this fantastic learning lab where we have the opportunity not only to learn about special places, but learn about what people are doing to protect them. And then, just as we've had this long association with Venice, we've had an equally long association with Rome, and this is a map just showing some of the places around the city. And again, I could talk forever and ever, but I won't. So I'm just going to talk about the Temple of Hercules and the Temple of Portunus. So the Temple of Hercules on the left, Portunus on the right. These are actually two of the oldest structures in Rome. They date from the 1st century. They both in many ways survived because they were turned into churches in the Middle Ages. And then that meant that they were changed physically. And so when they arrived on the Watch in 1996 for the Temple of Hercules and 2004 for the Temple of Portunus, it was much with the opportunity to, in essence, become detectives and try and understand how these buildings had changed over time. So one of the fun things that you get to do sometimes on these projects is really understand when were these structures, really first understood in broad ways. So this is a 15th century tourist map of Rome, and there the buildings are. I don't know if there's a pointer on here, we'll find out. So there's the Temple of Hercules. No. And then just behind it here is the Temple of Portunus. And you see the river, and they sit in an area that's known as the Forum Boarium, which was the major livestock market in ancient Rome. And so these were very important buildings, and their placement had great meaning. And then this is a early 19th century engraving. And I think the thing to notice here is the Temple of Hercules no longer has freestanding columns because it's been turned into a church, and therefore they needed a space for worship, and so they simply encased the columns in masonry. And then this is an early 20th century aerial photograph, and I think the thing to notice here is that the Temple of Hercules actually was very beautifully restored in the 1930s, so you see its columns are freestanding once again. Temple of Portunus next to it, and it's sitting on a little, I don't want to call it a grass island, but almost. And you see that the arterial road of the Via dei Fori Imperiali has not yet been built, and you see that there's still a connection to the river, even if the Forum Boarium now sits kind of low and no longer adjacent to the river the way it would have in antiquity, but the buildings survived. And then, I know everybody thinks Audrey Hepburn made her debut in Roman Holiday. I like to think the Temple of Hercules made its debut in this movie. And there it is, very beautifully restored, and its columns freestanding, and makes a lovely backdrop for this great film. And then here's what the buildings looked like last year. The buildings now have been fully restored. And the most interesting thing about it is that part of this conservation effort was not just to restore the buildings, but to really bring back some sense of the Forum Boarium. So you'll see there's now landscaping, there's more of a connection between the two buildings, and you can't see it in this photograph, but we actually helped create a staircase that leads up to the road where the river is, so that there's a little more of a sense how this connected with the rest of the city in its time. And I should say that even though these were a little bit forlorn and forgotten, just across the street is the Church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin with the sculpture called the Mouth of Truth, into which, in fact, Audrey Hepburn stuck her hand to see if she was telling the truth in that film. And so hundreds of thousands of tourists each season were going across the street, but not coming over to the Forum Boarium. And I'm very happy to say that this really has resulted in this being a destination once again. And so there's now benches, people come at lunchtime, and people are curious about this. And on the World Monuments Watch in 2016, We don't know whether something will be on it yet because we haven't had those meetings, but there is a nomination for yet another building that sits in this precinct. And if it were to be on the watch, it would be a natural opportunity to bring back yet one more piece of this part of Rome. And then there can be very unlikely places that catch our imagination. So this very unprepossessing entrance is actually the remains of a Roman basilica. And interestingly enough, there was a building known as Santa Maria Antiqua that had been lost in time. And in the late 19th century, the man who was actually head of the British school at Rome became quite interested in the quest to find Santa Maria Antiqua. And astonishingly, archaeologists were able to convince the Roman authorities to demolish a Baroque church that sat on top of this structure. And the man from the British school at Rome kind of kept a diary, and it was fascinating. So he would come and say, well, today they've put the ropes up, and then, a few days later he would say, well, today they moved all the art out. And so he chronicled, very interestingly, the leading up to the demolition of this church. And so the goal was to find this building known as Santa Maria Antiqua. And originally, they found this building adjacent to it, which was called the Chapel of the 40 Martyrs. And so they said, well, that's nice, but we still think Santa Maria Antiqua was here. And they managed to convince the Roman authorities to let them go on with their quest. And indeed, they were rewarded. So this entirely intact basilica was found. And astonishingly, very beautifully excavated. And then unfortunately, because of World War I, the work was interrupted. So the structure was sort of mothballed. And then later on, as post-World War II tourism in Rome mounted, and people began to visit the Forum more and more, this actually became a storage depot. And every time they found something that they didn't know where it went, it just got put into Santa Maria Antiqua. Until the 1990s, when a group of archaeologists and conservators and the superintendent of archaeology sort of woke up one day and said, we really have to do something about this. And again, my former employer, the Crest Foundation and World Monuments Fund, and the Italian authorities joined forces, and a project was launched to restore this very, very interesting building. And so on the left is one of the chapels that's been fully restored, and you see the very beautiful wall paintings. And on the right is what really makes this building unique, which is what you're seeing in this very confusing image are actually images of saints from 3 different centuries. So they were able to see that as the deterioration had occurred over time, they could discern images from the 7th, 8th, and 9th century in this building. But even more astonishingly, as this project went on, there were several fascinating facts that came to light. One was, as they were working on this restoration, they actually began to notice that they could see the process coming to life, and they were actually able to find in the mortar impressions of straw and other materials that had been used to set the paintings. And so they were able to determine things like, that was not a Roman method, it was an Eastern method. And so some of the paintings in this were actually done by people who would have come out of, the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, which was fascinating to understand. The other thing was they found both Greek and Latin inscriptions in the church. And there were a lot of theories going back and forth about why there would have been both Greek and Latin. And so some of it was, well, popes in that era, some of them came from the eastern provinces. They might have spoken Greek instead of Latin. Well, that was debunked because it was determined that all the popes would have learned Latin at some point. And then it was, interesting because this turned out to be a very, very important place for when different clergy were jockeying for position, sort of within the Catholic structure. And so a lot of people came and gave speeches here, so there were a lot of theories about did the different inscriptions relate to that. And then there was a conference just 2 years ago where somebody put forward a very, very interesting idea. They took the pilgrimage routes in Rome in this era and discovered that 5 different pilgrimage routes included Santa Maria Antiqua. And 2 of those pilgrimage routes were specifically for Greek-speaking pilgrims coming to Rome. And so they decided that these inscriptions were in Greek and Latin because they were really meant to be able to communicate with both groups of pilgrims. And so this is all new research that's just unfolding now, but it's an interesting opportunity where the conservation program has put these inscriptions in front of scholars in a way that they have not been for 100 years. And so many new things may be learned about Santa Maria Antiqua. And this building, because it had been a storage depot, had not been open to the public since it was excavated. And as a result of this project, and it sits right in the Roman Forum, just a little bit off the beaten path, it will now be open to the public, actually starting last October. And so it's a great opportunity for people to discover more about the history of Rome. And if we were to walk just a little farther up the hill, still in the Forum, but walking up to the top of the Palatine, Santa Maria Antiqua actually sits absolutely at the base of the Palatine Hill. You would find this building known as the Casina Farnese. And this is a 19th century image. And even though it looks in a ruinous state, this was actually how the Farnese family intended it. This was a pleasure garden and essentially a folly. So it was a summer palace and a pleasure garden. And then it somewhat fell into disrepair for 2 reasons. One is obviously the tourism to the Roman Forum is really focused on antiquity, and these Renaissance buildings had fallen a bit out of favor. And then also, admittedly, many people go to Rome in the summer months and it's hot, and not everybody wants to climb up to the top of the hill. And so this is what it looked like about 15 years ago, but still an intact building. And then this is what it looked like about 5 years ago when the Roman authorities decided they really wanted to bring the Palatine back and connect it to the Roman Forum and really show that it was worth that 10 or 15-minute walk up to the top of the hill to kind of understand how the city had evolved and how the Forum had always been a part of civic and private life in Rome. And so, once again, these great moments of discovery. So once it had been determined that the building was sound, you could start looking at the decoration. And so while this is a very, very small building with essentially 1 room and a loggia and then a spiral staircase and another room, the decorations are really exquisite. And I think also what was really astonishing was the Roman authorities decided to use the conservation of the Casina Farnese as an opportunity to talk once again about the Farnese gardens. And so one of the things that they did was they could not bring back all the water features and the fountains. And so believe it or not, that shimmering blue is colored resin, not water. But it's very, very evocative. And so it shows you how the space would have been used when the Farnese family was living there in the 16th and 17th century in the summers. And what was the reason for being up there in the summer? Well, this astonishing, commanding view, much as the Farnese would have experienced it, and the incredible breezes. So Rome can be hot and forbidding, but up on the Palatine Hill, there was sort of always a sense of expansiveness and fresh air. And we're working still with the Italian authorities on one last piece of the Farnese Gardens. These 2 little buildings known as the Farnese Aviaries. So here's what they looked like about a decade ago, and then on the right, a late 19th century engraving, probably a little more fanciful than what they actually looked like, but you get the sense that this would have been a grand piece of the Palatine Hill. Here's what it looked like about a year ago, and in fact, the conservation effort is nearly done. And so the entire exterior is now done. They're working on the interior, and the goal is to actually turn this into a small exhibit space so that once again, it's returning something to the public and providing more opportunities for people to discover hidden treasures that are somewhat hiding in plain view in Rome. And probably our most complicated project right now is the Carracci ceiling in a space known as the Carracci Gallery in the Palazzo Farnese, which is the French embassy in Rome. So this fantastic building with a facade by Michelangelo and features by Antonio da Sangallo, and then this exquisite ceiling painting by the Carracci brothers. And what's interesting is this building has been plagued with conservation problems probably since the day it was completed. So it's a very large expanse, a very, very beautiful and elaborate set of paintings, and very beautiful stucco on the walls, and well as sculptural. And as early as the 18th century, there are notes about the building being in disrepair, the ceiling showing cracks. In the 19th century, we know that there were great fears that the ceiling was going to collapse. And so one of the things they did was, in essence, try and staple the paintings back up into the walls. And so there are literally thousands of little tiny nails that go throughout the painted surface in an effort to bind it back to the moorings up in the ceiling. And in the 20th century, there have been 3 or 4 documented interventions, again, trying to deal with the engineering issues of the ceiling. And so we were invited by the Italian government to collaborate with them on this project. And so this is really a thorough undertaking to understand how best to anchor the ceiling, protect the paintings, and also restore these very beautiful stuccos which have not been dealt with. And so the project's about at the midpoint now. It'll probably finish sometime late 2015, early 2016. We're actually having a big celebration in June because we originally hoped it would be done sooner, but it'll be a magical experience for the group of donors who are traveling with us in June to see the ceiling nearly done. And as you can see, it takes really a Herculean effort to work on this because you have to be up on very high scaffolding, in a way working the way the Carracci did with your arms above your head a good deal of the time. But it'll be a marvelous opportunity, once again, for people to appreciate this great reception room. And so I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this. It is our 50th anniversary. Italy has figured prominently. We've worked on about 60 projects in Italy over time. And even though the cover of this book shows Angkor Wat, we don't love Cambodia more than we love Italy. And I just wanted to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Byron, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, where he talks about places thoroughly. And while this is a very, very long poem, and this is only one line in it, I think it really sums up why those of us at World Monuments Fund and our colleagues do what we do, because we love these places. So while stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world. Thank you very much.
I think Lisa Ackerman gave a brilliant presentation, and I'm proud to say that she's an NYU alumna, among other things. And we also should reveal the fact that she at least half Italian, Sicilian.
That's true.
And even if you didn't mention any Sicilian side,
I could have.
I know you could. I know you could.
You'll have to invite me back.
I'd be very happy to have you back. And Lisa very kindly accepts to answer some of your questions that you might have about the monuments that the World Monument Fund has restored and is still restoring, both in Italy and also in other parts of the world. Yes?
One thing I've never understood is when you support a project, does that mean you gather the funds and give it to the government to hire workers, or do you actually get in there and hire the workers and oversee the work?
We do both, actually. So in Italy, most often, we're gathering the funding, and it's largely the Italian government hiring workers or their own staff. And so we're largely a funder in Italy. But that's not always the case. So with the Temple of Hercules and the Temple of Portunus, for instance, we were asked to fund the conservation, and we really decided it was an important element to really bring back the Forum Borarium. So we were really part of the development of that project. So even though it was all Italians who worked on it and we funded it, I mean, in many ways, what our involvement meant was a much more expanded project. And we actually sponsored somebody to do research on the Forum Borarium, and we published a small book. we are still working on a lot of the interpretations. So it depends. You know, at the Casina Farnese and the Farnese aviaries, we were really, again, put in that position where we fully supported the idea of conserving them, but we felt bringing back some sense of the gardens was an important piece of it. So, you know, these partnerships are usually for us not just money. And the Italian government, I should say, in all of these instances has matched our money more than dollar for dollar. So, you know, they're putting a lot of resources into the project as well. Yes?
Do you know if anything is being done for the preservation of the synagogue in Florence?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Because it was damaged by an earthquake a few years ago, and it's now barely open sometimes just for congregants and not for the public.
Well, I didn't know that. You know, we're happy. We have a Jewish heritage program, and we always have, like we're working at the Scuola Canton in Venice. We'd be very happy to learn more about the circumstances in Ferrara and if there's any way to help. Well, we'll try and investigate that. This is how we find out about things, is often people bring them to our attention.
As a follow-up to the question of the lady, how does the list of watch sites come about? So, for example, the lady made a suggestion, and do you receive petitions? Do you receive
We do.
letters? People that tell you there is this place that is really in danger?
Absolutely.
And then you have a committee that decides and makes
So
recommendations?
the way the watch works is anybody can nominate a site to the watch, and there's information on our website about how to do that. And then we convene, all of our staff will come together for a week in July. So we usually get about 200 to 250 nominations for the watch. We usually reduce the list to the last couple of years. It's been 67. We try to have no particular number. We just try and reflect what are the most endangered sites at that moment that come to us. And then we convene an external expert panel that makes the final determination of what should be on the list, and then many of those places on the list become projects for us. Yes?
Do you do any work in Puglia?
We have done projects in Puglia. Right now, we don't have any.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to know your connection with the UNESCO choice of World Heritage location, like Matera or the Trulli. Are you connected to those choices?
We're not. So,
You just do the work,
right.
and then they choose you.
Exactly. And then we work with UNESCO frequently, but the way UNESCO works is, so every country that's a member nation of the United Nations is eligible to sign the World Heritage Convention and be a member nation of UNESCO. And if that's the case, then they have a national committee of something called the International Council of Monuments and Sites, and that makes them eligible to put forward suggestions to the World Heritage Center for World Heritage inscription. And so I'm glossing over a lot of the details, but that's essentially how it works. Every country has something called a tentative list, and then the World Heritage Center in Paris has a system for how they review them, and then they meet every June to review the nominations and determine what goes on the World Heritage list or not. And so Matera, which we had nothing to do with its World Heritage inscription, but we have in fact worked on conservation projects in Matera. And Matera is scheduled to be the cultural capital of Europe in a couple of years, so there'll be a lot of attention paid to activities in that region in the coming years. And we're a frequent partner, so our work in Lalibela in Ethiopia, we're actually in partnership with the World Heritage Center. So we work a lot together, but we're a non-governmental agency and they're an intergovernmental agency, so they're bound by a lot of international treaties for how they work.
Thank you.
Sure? Yes?
I wonder if you have any plan to let the public to see the Carracci gallery. I know it's complicated, it's a French embassy, and I was lucky enough 2 years ago, there was a special night that the French embassy was open all night. So people lined up, and I was one of them, I waited 2 hours. So beautiful feeling, so I really love to see it. more people?
Yes, and it will be open to the public. So one of the conditions of World Monuments Fund collaboration is public access. So the Temple of Portunus, the Temple of Hercules, Santa Maria Antiqua, the Casina Farnese, and the Farnese Aviaries were all places that were closed. And so part of our collaboration, in a way, is leverage for the government to then say, they've taken philanthropic dollars, they have to open up the sites to the public, even if it's limited. So in Italy, every June, there's a program called Roma Nascosta, Hidden Rome, and so many of these sites that are not open regularly are open during the month of June, by reservation, but still it gets them open, and the more successful programs like that are, the more pressure it puts on the government to open the sites. Yes, but it's getting better. And so for the Temple of Portunus and the Temple of Hercules, they're now going to be open 2 weekends a month, for instance. And Santa Maria Antiqua will be open every other Saturday. And so, it's a slow process because these are small spaces and the Italian government has to figure out how to pay for guards. And, there are a lot of complications with the Palazzo Farnese and the French embassy. There will be a system, once again, to have it open by reservation once the work is done. And, that's still being negotiated between the French and Italian governments. But, the hope is that it'll be open something like 100 days a year.
Wow. If they succeeded, that the War Monument Fund also deserved a prize for international diplomacy. The building belongs to the Italian government, but is run by the French. So they will have to come up with something that, on one hand, there are, of course, security issues related to the fact that this is a diplomatic site and you need to protect the diplomatic integrity of the embassy, that the building is owned by the Italian government, and the War Monument Fund restored it. So if you really come up with 100 days in which the...
Well, we'll wait and see. That's
a huge victory. And by the way, you remember that Palazzo Farnese is the location for the second act of Tosca. First act is Santa Maria, second act is Palazzo Farnese. Actually, that very room, I believe, is the one in which Tosca is giving the concert.
Castel San Angelo.
And the third act is Castel Sant'Angelo. So there are several layers of memories, artistic,
right,
architectural, and even musical.
No, absolutely. And I think that's one of the fun things about working on these projects is finding ways to convey that information to the public, that these sites appear in literature, or they, like even in film, there's Rome has been a great stage for film. And so, one of the great joys is finding ways to make this happen. And, I don't have a crystal ball to know exactly how many days the Palazzo Farnese will be open eventually, but I think there really is a goal to have it be, even though it'll be by reservation, and because it is an embassy, there'll be security that might be heavier than at other sites, but I think there really is an intent to try and have it open on a very regular basis, and the Italian government is 100% behind that desire to see it. When I was a student, for instance, in the 1980s, you could go quite easily into the Palazzo Farnese. It was open 3 days a week. You had to make a reservation, but it was not difficult. And so it was only after 9/11, when security issues around the world changed, that the embassy really decided they could not have people freely go in and out of the building. So, we have to take into consideration, even though we all trained as art historians and architectural conservators, we seem to have to take many things into consideration as we work on these projects. Oh, is there one more question? Sure.
What percentage of the restorations are secular, non-religious related?
I don't have any idea, and that's embarrassing, but I would say,
If we were to judge by this presentation, I don't know, 80-20, 85-15?
I don't know. George, do you have any thoughts? Having worked on the 50th, I guess if I had to come up with, maybe I would say 75% religious sites.
But it's very difficult also to judge
All
what is religious and what is secular, because the temples, as you mentioned,
No, everywhere.
are they secular or are they religious? They were built as pagan temples to the Roman god. They were turned into churches, and then again they were.
Yes, and today they're just heritage sites. They're not active
I mean,
religious.
especially a place like Rome, where you literally see the straight of history, and like let's say a church like San Clemente, for example, it is a religious building because there is a Christian church, and then there is an under church, a basilica, and then underneath there is a temple to Mita in Mexico.
Well, pagan is religiosity. So I am very specifically asking, like there was a statue of, I forgot what it's called, on the horse.
Oh,
Corleone.
Corleone. So that's a secular site. I mean, I think it depends, again, it's hard to make sweeping generalizations, but obviously throughout history, great effort has been made to build religious sites, and so they are often the buildings that survive. But if you look at our work in the Middle East, for instance, we have a project at Babylon in Iraq, and that is not a religious site. We've had a project at a site called Qusr Amra in the desert in Jordan, which again was a private home of a caliph, and the building that we've been preserving was a bathhouse that was part of the complex, so not a religious site. We've worked at Petra. You could classify Petra as an urban settlement, but it has religious elements to it. We were not working on those, but the Forbidden City in Beijing.
Stowe happens, which completed. I'm just thinking of the big projects that are coming online now.
Yeah, Strawberry Hill in England, which was Horace Walpole's house and kind of the birthplace of Gothic revival. So, I mean,
Although they may not function that way anymore.
yeah, so I mean, it's hard to say because I think many of the sites have some religious connotation to them, but our reason for preserving them is not necessarily the perpetuation of any particular religious activity, but it's about the continuity of cultural activity. So at Angkor, our work there started in 1989, and we still work there today. And in many ways, even though those are Buddhist temple sites, and when you go, you see Buddhist monks at the sites, but our purpose for being there really is the rebuilding of the country after the Khmer Rouge period. So we've trained about 200 Cambodians to be conservators and site managers, and we employ 120 Cambodians full-time year-round, and so it's very much about workforce development and community stability, and so they are preserving ancient temples, but our role there is about community engagement. So, I think many of the sites, if you scratch the surface, have religion there. So it's a good question. And now I'm going to have to go back and count. So when somebody asks me that again, I won't be completely caught off guard. But, I think it's a reality that there are many important places around the world that have survived because they are religious.
There's probably very few that you deal with that are still functioning as religious sites. I think maybe that's more
Could you repeat what the gentleman said?
Yes, he said there may be very few that are actually still functioning as religious sites today. I mean, that's
There are a number are still. I think all the South American churches are all functioning.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, some of them still function as religious sites. Some of them are pure tourism sites. And then, I don't know, we've worked at a lot of places in the Andes where they have all the same problems of dwindling congregations, and so the buildings are being preserved not so much for the religious aspects, but again, for preserving the cultural heritage of communities. And, the adobe churches in New Mexico, for instance, were a World Monuments Fund project in the 1980s and 1990s. And those are still consecrated chapels, but they do not hold services with any regularity. But there are families in those communities sort of charged with caring for those chapels. And so that,
But it's a perpetuation of religion.
yeah,
I mean, you can't.
right. I mean, and I think the only thing I can say is that if we looked at all of them, probably more of them have been Christian sites than not, but we've worked on many Buddhist sites and Muslim sites. We worked at the Blue Mosque in Cairo, which is still a functioning mosque, and so
You're ecumenical, but it's still perpetuation of religion. But I got my answer.
Okay, sure. Yes?
Dave, what is the newest building in Italy that you were involved with? Any modern building?
Probably the newest building that we've been involved with in Italy has been 19th century buildings. We've not been involved in any 20th century sites in Italy that I can think of. In the US, we've been involved in quite a number of modern sites. So we've been part of the advocacy effort for Orange County Government Center, which is the Paul Rudolph building. We were part of an effort to try and save a school in New Orleans, which was a 1950s, very interesting modern building. And also Paul Rudolph's Riverview High School in Sarasota, which was demolished, but again, we were part of an advocacy effort to try and come up with design solutions to save the building. So we actually were just part of a panel discussion at MoMA on Latin American modernism. So while Italy we haven't been involved in modern buildings, we have in other parts of the world. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
We thank again Lisa Ackerman, the Executive Vice President of the World Monument Fund. And once again, we take this opportunity as an institution that works for the promotion of Italian culture to thank the fund for the fantastic job it has done in Italy and in other parts of the world. It's not only that we applaud your efforts for Italy. Everything you do to preserve culture and to preserve art everywhere in the world is a service that you do to the whole world, and therefore we are all very appreciative. And of course, as you know, and as Lisa very elegantly didn't mention, but the World Monument Fund relies heavily on donations. And now, at the risk of being fired from NYU because I'm supposed to raise funds only for Casa Italiana, New York University, I remind you that on their website you find all the information that you might need in order to become a supporter of the World Monuments Fund. And that's the only way they can survive, and that's the only way they can continue to provide the kind of wonderful support that Lisa Ackerman mentioned to us tonight. And now we're going to have a glass of wine in our Sarah's garden upstairs. Please join us. Thank you.